Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So this inshallah is our 6th lesson out of 12 lessons inshallah ta'ala on the Fiqh of Da'wah course. And so far what we've discussed is the different types of furuq, the different types of sects in Christianity. We've basically disproven the Trinity and we're still working our way through proving all of Gorah, which is to prove God's existence, prove His oneness, prove that the revelation is from Allah Azza wa Jal, and to prove that Prophet Muhammad is a Sadiq al-Amin, so that when we're giving da'wah to people who are non-Muslims, we can guide them towards Islam. We also talked about ad-din al-nasiha in this course, how to advise Muslims to become better Muslims. And in today's segment, what we want to discuss is personal growth factors for a da'i, so for a da'wah carrier, both from a psychological and Islamic perspective. And we're going to look at the history of biblical compilation, so the different books of the Old Testament and the New Testament, so we can just have a general familiarity with what exactly the Bible is, because the Bible comes from the word biblios, which means a collection of books, so we can see the structure and the format of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and a little bit about the authenticity and who wrote what, inshallah ta'ala. We will then be looking at some of the aqidah or theological differences between Paul or Saul of Tarsus, who basically was the major mini Dajjal of the time of Isa alayhi salam, and now his belief system differs with that of the Hawariyun or the disciples of Isa alayhi salam, his Sahaba, and how they differ in the Bible. So that will be important also for Christians to note why there's already an early ikhtilaf from the Bible itself, showing that there's a new story, a new different way of looking at the belief system, which was not that what Isa alayhi salam or Jesus, peace be upon him, actually taught. And lastly, we'll look at some quiz questions at the end. I'm not going to force any of you to answer them, but if you want to try some of the questions, inshallah, we can do that. If not, I will help you with the little mini non-graded quiz at the end, just to make sure that you guys are understanding the material. Bi'idhnillah. So, bismillah. Slide clicker. Hopefully you work today. Oh, I'm getting a signal. Just got to make sure we're going in the right direction. All right. So the first slide is going to be more from the psychological perspective. This is more to do with the growth of a da'i. So if you're wondering, why don't I maybe understand a lot of the differences of opinion that exist within Christianity and Judaism? How come I don't know the roots of Buddhism and Hinduism? How do I not know yet how to cater towards these different religions to best show them the light of Islam? Well, some of the reasons is you just need to invest a little bit of time in reading. Could be just 10 or 20 minutes a day, but it doesn't even necessarily have to be reading. It can be also listening to lectures. If you do this on a constant basis for about 10 years, don't be surprised if you actually know all of the sciences of Islam, at least on a strong foundational level. Otherwise, if you're never going to allow yourself to be in the position to give da'wah, you're never going to improve. So just like when you need to learn how to swim, you need to get into the water first. It's just like with every other skill that you learn, you have to start working at it in order to improve. It's important to have the growth-like mentality as opposed to the fixed mentality. Research has shown that as long as you believe you can improve, then you can. But people who say, you know what, I was born with a set limit amount of ability, this will actually hinder your ability, not just in the da'wah, but in life in general. And another thing that they noticed was the issue of sabr. Actually, I'm going to talk about that more in a slide to come up. But maybe I'll mention it just now quickly. There was a study done by a psychologist. Her name is Angela Duckworth. And she used to be a math teacher, and then she went into like the corporate business world, and then she went into psychology, and she wanted to do a study looking at all the major behavior criterion to see what makes a person successful in this dunya. Now, not necessarily from a religious perspective, but what makes people successful in general in life. And she measured lots of things: social status, race, whatever you could basically, any metrics you could have, IQ. And she found that whatever she measured, the one factor or the one criterion that was the top of the list to predict success, it didn't have to do with money, it didn't have to do with where you were born, it didn't have to do with who you knew or your networking circle. It had to do with one main variable, which she identified as grit. And grit for her basically means passion and perseverance. Basically to have hamasa, motivation, yani tahfiz, you have a goal, you're goal centered, you know your maqsad, you know your objective. And the other thing is perseverance, which is sabr. Because you could have all the amazing goals in the world, or you could have an amazing dream, but if you're not going to be willing to have the stamina and to deal with the difficulty and the haraj, the challenges that come with success, then you cannot necessarily be a successful da'i or very successful in life in general. So you need to know your goal, your vision, but you need to be ready to have some blood, sweat, and tears along the way. That's the path to greatness. Anybody who says, you know, I can't deal with challenge, I can't deal with difficulty, I can't deal with stress, it's not going to really optimize you really in any field until you overcome that challenge, inshallah ta'ala. And as far as unsuccessful people are concerned, they spend most of their time criticizing others. They don't want to forgive others. They want to just waste time in general, so they might be just watching TV. They're really just selling themselves short. It's their own fault if they're not progressing. They're just not scheduling enough time for that particular growth. So I think I talked enough about the generic stuff here for a sec. The other way, sorry. The clicker goes backwards to go forwards. So, why is sabr such a big deal from the Islamic perspective? There's a hadith, it's narrated that Sa'id ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu reported that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, that he was asked, O Messenger of Allah, which people are tested most severely? So the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, they are the prophets, then the next best, then the next best. A man is put to trial according to his religion. If he is firm in his religion, his trials will become more severe. If he is weak in his religion, he is put to trial according to the strength in religion. The servant will continue to be put to trial, this is still part of the hadith, until he is left walking upon the earth without any sin. So the additional ni'mah, the additional blessing we have with the sabr of being in the da'wah and doing the work of the anbiya, alayhi salatu wassalam, is that Allah is expiating our sins just for the struggle that we're going through. So we're going to hear some rude comments. We might even have somebody spit in our face. They might slander us. They might, threaten us. They might try to blackmail us. But regardless of all the threats that they try to use, that's only going to lead to, inshallah, the sins of our records being erased and our maqam, our station, inshallah, raising on the Day of Judgment and having an increase in hasanat bi'idhnillah. And as far as how much you need to know, we did discuss this hadith briefly in the early part of the course, but you don't actually have to be a master of Quran, hadith, tafsir, usul al-hadith, ulum al-Quran, of fiqh al-muqarana, of comparative fiqh. You don't have to be a master in any of those sciences, but as long as you know something about the Quran, you have a starting point. I'm not saying that's the optimal level. I'm not saying you should just settle for only knowing a few surahs, but technically, if you even just knew Surah Al-Ikhlas, you know enough to start giving da'wah. And as you progress, you'll start to learn more. You'll start to ask more questions. We're going to start looking at some websites today of stuff you can use to start building your knowledge base, inshallah ta'ala. What the Prophet ﷺ said in the Hadith al-Sahih, according to Shaykh Albani, he said that, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, or he narrated that, بَالِغُ عَنِي وَلَوْ آيَةً. So convey from me even an ayah. So like I said, if you know قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ, you know the beginning of Tawheed of Allah, you know a place to get started with. And Surah Al-Ikhlas is a very beautiful surah because it explains that nothing came before Allah and Allah did not give birth basically to any gods after him. So when people understand this concept, they will not keep asking, well, then what came before that? And what came before that? We're going to also discuss that this is also logically impossible for something to happen before Allah, because if you say something happened before Allah existed, then you have to explain where did that come from and where did that come from. The only way you can explain the events that happen right now in current time, there has to be something that existed outside of time that set all actions into motion. For example, I'll give you a very mundane example. If there's a soccer ball on the floor and it's already rolling, I don't presume that the ball is rolling because of itself. There must have been some force acting on the ball to make the ball start rolling. And likewise, when we look at creation, when we look at the Big Bang, which scientists have verified this universe didn't always exist in the form you see it today. This universe expanded, and we proved it using light spectrometry. Dr. Albert Hubble was the person who realized that all the stars in the galaxies have been expanding since the Big Bang occurred. Well, then what made the Big Bang occur, which started the universe? That initial explosion doesn't happen without an agent or some kind of power acting upon it. So therefore, it is logically necessary for there to be something external to the universe to cause the universe to exist. We're actually going to prove that God exists using logic. It's just coming up in one of the future lectures within this course, inshallah ta'ala. But just giving you an idea right now about you don't really need to know a lot to basically be able to prove some points like how God exists. So next slide. This time I'm going to press the right button, inshallah. We're going the right way, but I went too fast there. So some of the du'at in Islam, like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Dr. Bilal Phillips, I'm not going to get into like the nitty gritties of like which scholars are good and bad. Like these are scholars that have invested a lot of time in Islam, and they came across a particular book written by a non-Muslim, and they said this is basically a book that everybody should know about, even though a non-Muslim wrote it. It has to do with basically the right way to approach visions and dreams and like how to really set goals in life. And so what Stephen R. Covey, what he argues, and instead of even reading the entire book, there's just summaries. You can actually go online and read a summary of the book. There's 7 main points that he argues in order for you to really live up to your potential. And so the first thing he says is to work smarter, not harder. There are so many organizations in the world where they think just putting in more hours is the best way to do something. But if you're a computer programmer, you know if you can find a simpler way to make the program work, that's better for you and that's better for the customer. And likewise, for example, I work in a school. So if I see there's a specific way that the office should be managing the school or the teacher should be teaching, and they start using the easier method, which yields better results, that's both better for the teacher and the administration, as well as it's better for the students. So we need to start finding more efficient ways to do things. That includes our study habits. That includes whatever we do in life. How can we do things easier? We're putting in less effort, but getting better results. The second thing he mentions is to be proactive. So this has to do with you look at how to solve a situation without reacting to it. A lot of times in the media, and this can have a dawah impact as well, the media will come up to you and they might say, you know, do you condone terrorism? Do you condone what happened to Israel on October the 7th? They try to set the stage and try to get a reaction out of you. What you should do is you should control the narrative of the discussion, and you should lead them to understanding why they have the wrong conclusions. So this takes a little bit of skill, but you need to think ahead of where you want this conversation to go and not be led wherever somebody's trying to take you. This is just a general skill that's good to know with all relationships. And especially if people are arguing with you or debating with you, you need to know how to shift the conversation towards the direction you want it to go to. And like, for example, I remember I was discussing with the vice principal at my school at Al Taqwa Academy, and she was saying, you know, we really need to write a summary for all the high school students before they graduate. We need to have something that tells them how do they answer all the fiqh questions of like why women wear hijab and you know why riba is not allowed and all this. You could do that and you could give some of the hikam, some of the wisdom. Sometimes Allah tells us in the Quran and Sunnah, but sometimes He doesn't. But the more important question that you want everybody to agree with, which basically stops arguments going for days or hours in different directions, is you need to get them to basically realize that if this Quran is from Allah Azza wa Jal, and if I could prove that to you today, and out of the 1,000 plus scientific ayats in the Quran, if I just showed you like 5 or 6 or 7 of them, and you saw that they were always consistently accurate, then isn't that enough to prove that beyond reasonable doubt that this book is from Allah? Imagine if you had 1,000 scientific signs all found within one book with 0 errors and 0 mistakes, and that the scientists that existed at the time when the Quran was being revealed, even they didn't have knowledge of this. And science later verified that the Quran was completely accurate on all of these points. Wouldn't that be enough evidence that this book is from Allah? If they see this and they're sincere and they're like, well, it must be from Allah. If you've proven this, you've already proven the question of hijab and jihad and riba and every other thing? How have you solved all the other questions? Because if you know this book is from Allah, then who am I or you or anyone else to argue with our maker, our creator, our sustainer, the one who we're all going to have to return to? Do you think it benefited Iblis in the least for him to say, I am made from fire and Adam is made from dirt? Do you think his argument did him any good when he was in Jannah for the time period that he was in? There's no point actually in debating the nitty-gritty details. There would have been no point in, if, for example, if Adam alayhi salam was to question, why can't I eat from this tree? Or why can't I go near this tree? What are you going to solve by trying to debate with Allah? You're not going to, if anything, you're just asking to possibly be punished. So when random people come up to us, sometimes they can even be Muslims. I understand that some people might have a faith crisis. They'd be like, oh, I'm really struggling with it, whatever it is, hijab, or avoiding pork, or avoiding mixed gatherings and like without any conditions in it. We have ways to deal with those issues, but the most central issue you need to deal with is if you know this is from Allah and you know you will return to Him and you know this book is 100% from Him, it doesn't matter at that point because you know you're going to be held accountable. And if we know that we're abideen, we know we're servants of Allah, and we know Allah is the Rabb, then how can we ever challenge that? You know what I mean? The servant of a king in this dunya doesn't go to the king and say, hey, I don't like any of the laws that you're telling me to do. What will the king do in this dunya? If a man from, like, let's say, from the 12th century, medieval age, if a servant comes up to a king of this dunya, a human king, and says, I don't want to follow any of your laws, what's going to happen to him? He's going to be thrown into prison or killed, or both. So that's not going to solve anything. So when you're talking about the creator who knows everything of existence and he actually wants good for us, but he will test us. And sometimes he'll tell us to do things and he won't tell us why, but we know we have to obey him and we know we have to return to him and there's no other way. We can't just like on the day of judgment say, you know what, I'm going to recalibrate my GPS and I'm going to try to skip the day of judgment. You don't have that option. So when you explain to people, when you know the book is from Allah and you know the day of judgment is happening and there's no way to escape this, the only logical thing, the only rational thing for a human being to do would be to submit, which is Islam. Islam is a verb. It comes from the word salama. It does mean peace, but the main meaning of Islam is submission. Ta'a. Ta'a lillah, which is obedience. That is your gateway to Jannah, inshallah ta'ala. And if anybody knows this, then they'll know, even if I don't understand why Allah forbade certain things in this life, it technically doesn't matter. Because I'm not required to know that, but I do know that the one who's going to ensure I have eternal happiness is Allah. So whether I understand all the rulings or not doesn't matter. If I know it's from Him, that technically is the most crucial issue here. Otherwise, when we're trying to be successful in life, we need to know our vision. So if our goal is to go to Jannah, which inshallah everybody here, we have this vision in mind, we need to plan it out. What are all the steps that we want to take towards getting it? And obviously, we should focus on what's most important. So even in Islam, we're told to put the fara'id first, sunnah second. And then if we have some time, we can have some leisure, relaxation, time just doing mubahat activities, permissible activities. The next tip is to think win-win. A lot of times in the un-Islamic world and un-Islamic way of thinking, they tell you that if you want to get ahead in life, you need to step on somebody else's shoulders. You need to put somebody else down so you can prop yourself up. And they tell you that it's a cutthroat business out there. Life is tough. Just worry about yourself is what the advice that they tend to give. Islam tells you otherwise. And if you actually think about it, normally when you help people, they have what they call the paying it forward. What you'll probably notice that in life is if you help a lot of people, you never know what day in the future that same person that you helped maybe 5-10 years ago is going to help you get a job or help pick you up on the side of the road when your car's not working. So there's a multiplicity of khair that comes from being a person who wants khair for others. And we said before that the hadith that says ad-din an-nasiha, True nasiha is when you actually want good for the other person. It's not just istishara, giving advice if you want to shame the person. But when you actually want good for the other person, this is nasiha. And the Prophet ﷺ said, ad-din al-nasiha. This whole religion is sincere advice where we want good for the other person. Otherwise, the other last two steps is to listen before we speak. So many times in da'wah and in life, if we want to do all the talking in the beginning of the conversation, the other person doesn't feel respected, and they're probably not going to respect us, and they're probably going to stop listening to us before we can even effectively teach somebody about Islam. So a lot of times, and this happens in sales as well, they tell you to be a good listener. If you're not a good listener, if the person doesn't feel you even care what they have to say, why would they listen to you? So you'll see the top people in business, like if they work in sales for Toyota or Ford or for any car company, they spend a lot of time listening to the audience or the person who's coming in to buy. They want to know exactly what does this person want. They're not going to try to sell them a car SUV they don't want. They need to bridge a connection for what they think the customer needs, right? And sales is all about showing a need. In da'wah, the main need we need to show is people are lost without knowing their creator. And we know throughout history, throughout the entire human civilization, aside from this little wave of atheism that started in the last, I would say, 50 to 100 years, every civilization on the face of the earth from all human history has always had the idea of believing in a God or a higher power because it's instinctive. The human being wants to understand, how did the universe come to be? How did I get here? What am I doing here? And where am I going? And the only way for you to answer these questions is by knowing who the true creator is. That's obviously what the need we're going to show people. So this need you have for spirituality and this need for you to understand why you got here and then where you're going, this is what Islam teaches. And then lastly, when we work in groups and we teach each other, then we all basically help each other. A society, an economy doesn't run effectively unless everybody is sharing their skills and their talents. You know, like if I need food, I go to the grocery store and I know that that grocery store is being supplied by farmers. But if I want to be the farmer and the merchant and the teacher and the architect and the builder of a city, I can't take on that many specialties and master them all. So that's why synergy, even when it comes to da'wah, when you work with other people and you learn different Islamic sciences, when you pool your talents together, you will be much more effective working as a jama'ah. And the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah is His hand, or meaning His support, is with the jama'ah. So Allah supports those who work in groups. So we're not actually supposed to, for the most part, try to segregate ourselves from society. We should, when it comes to da'wah projects, we should be doing our best to work with others. This will amplify our abilities in the da'wah, inshallah ta'ala. So if you ever feel like you get stuck in street da'wah or just conversational da'wah when you're meeting people, school, coffee shop, work, online, wherever it happens to be, there are a number of different resources we can look at. One of them is letmeturnthetables.com. This is also good when you're dealing with deviant sects in Islam. So sometimes you'll be giving da'wah, but then somebody who's Qadiani or Ahmadiyya tries to jump in the conversation and say, you know what, jihad, oh, we don't even believe jihad exists anymore, because for them they believe it was abolished, right? They had the person they claim is a prophet, Mirza Ghulam Ahmed, they believe that he had the right to basically pick and choose which ahkam in Islam gets to stay and which ones don't get to stay. Even though, ironically, their whole dynasty is inside of Britain. They live in Britain. Their so-called Khilafah is being ruled by the monarch of Britain. And it's not surprisingly that it was a religion that was injected into Pakistan and into India by the help of the British. And it's not by coincidence, or I should say by accident, that they tried to abolish jihad, because they never wanted Islam to ever rule ever again. So even if when you look at this religion right from the get-go, we could prove, like theologically, it doesn't make any sense. Like the Prophet, like the Quran mentions that the Prophet ﷺ is Khatam al-Anbiya. He is the seal of the prophets. And the Prophet ﷺ said in a Sahih Hadith, La Nabiyya Badi, there's no prophet after me. And he said, if there was a prophet after me, it would have been Umar ibn al-Khattab, but obviously that never happened. So the point is, whether we look at it both textually or also logically, there couldn't have been another prophet to come. How would we deal with all these little side tangent issues if they arise in the da'wah? I said 95% of the time this won't happen. If you can just prove God's existence, prove His oneness, prove revelation, and then prove that the Prophet was a Sadiq al-Amin, you can prove Islam 95% of the time without interruptions. But when you have somebody come up to you and say, hey, you're not preaching the right Islam, or you have somebody saying, hey, actually, the Bible is perfectly preserved, and they try to make some argument based on this. So this website, Let Me Turn the Tables, will help you with a lot of the specific challenges that will be brought forth by Christians, as well as by deviant people who call themselves Muslim. So letmeturnthetables.com. Sometimes you're dealing with a fiqh issue or an aqidah issue where maybe the topic is a bit blurry. In that case, I would suggest you go to these websites: Islam QA, Islam Web, and Seeker's Guidance Answers. These three websites is more for like fiqh issues. So if somebody needs to know the evidences and the reasoning behind certain rulings, if you want to entertain that in the street da'wah, I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm saying that if you want to do it from time to time, or some person, they're ready to accept Islam today. They agree with everything that you said, but they only have one issue, and then they say it's about a very specific fiqh topic, then these three websites will be very useful, because they will give you a detailed explanation from different madhahib, from the madhahib of the Hanafis, the Malikis, the Shafis, the Hanbalis, as well as some of the mutaqaddimin or mutaakhirin, the early and the later scholars, to see why are there differences of opinion and why certain rulings are the way they are in Islam. So we have resources that anybody can actually access. And if you prefer Arabic, Islam QA and Islam Web is both in English and in Arabic, as well as some other languages like French and Spanish. So it's actually quite universal in terms of its use. Some books that I would recommend for you guys in terms of giving da'wah, especially to Jews, Christians, and atheists, because that's going to be our target audience most of the time, as well as secularists. So if personally myself, when I accepted Islam, right after reading the Quran, the first book that I read about Islam after that, which gave me a lot of information about the scientific ayats in the Quran and the prophecies of Prophet Muhammad mentioned in the Bible, they were found in none other than the first book I have listed here. It's called a guided, let me see if I can read it a little bit closer here. It says a guided, illustrated, it's too blurry, but basically it's something like a guided, an illustrated guide to Islam. And it has this like picture of the globe or the earth and the Quran and Masjid al-Nabawi behind it. This book is short. It's like maybe 60 pages or less. This book, if you read it, it's illustrated, so it has a lot of nice pictures. It shows you the different scientific ayat. It shows you the need for why we need Prophet Muhammad to clarify all the issues of confusion that happened after the time of Christianity starting to spread. It shows you where Prophet Muhammad is mentioned in the Bible. It's very straightforward in proving that Islam is the true, universal, and complete religion, and it was the religion for all time, including the end of times. And in less than about 60 pages, it's very convincing. And I could show you books that are much larger, 300, 400, 500-page books. But this is honestly more than enough for the average person living in the West. So this, alongside with obviously spending time with the Quran and being around the right people, should be enough to get people on the right track. There are some other books. There's a book about the true message of Jesus Christ. This is written by Dr. Bilal Phillips, who has a master's degree in Islamic studies from Saudi. And he has a lot of interesting works, but this book, it's probably around 100 pages. I can't actually see the number of pages on the screen because it's blurry from here. But if you go on the PowerPoint, which is on the Google Classroom, you'll see the exact page numbers and how many pages there are for each book. This one's probably around 100 pages. This book will show you a lot about what Isa actually said, which shows the Islamic message, as well as the major mistakes and pitfalls in the Bible. So you can educate yourself and others why you cannot rely on the Christianity that exists today. Then you have the Ahmed Didat collection. All those books on the far right side of the PowerPoint, all those books you can download for free. These are all books written by probably one of the greatest pioneers of the Dawah in the West, which is Ahmed Didat. So all those books mainly have to do with proving to Jews and Christians that Islam is true. So really, you can take your pick. Some of, for example, one of those books has to do with just dealing with Jehovah's Witness, the people who come to your door and they knock on it and they try to ask you 20 questions about Jehovah's Witness Christianity, and they try to hand you pamphlets, and they'll never accept pamphlets from you because they see that as an act of defeat. And by the way, technically, you should never accept a pamphlet from a Jehovah's Witness. Not because you don't know how to refute it, it's because whenever they feel they handed a pamphlet to you, they feel like they're now converting people to their side. But invite them into your home. Invite them to have a discussion, to sit down, have coffee or tea, and discuss from the Islamic perspective why we're actually here on earth. And inshallah, hopefully you can convince some of them to accept Islam. They already know the Trinity is wrong, but unfortunately they don't know that there's another prophet after Isa alayhi salam, so that's going to take some work to clarify to them. There's a book called What Did Jesus Really Say? It's written by a man named Mikhail ibn Abdullah. He might be a convert. So it's about 300 to 400 pages. I have it in print at home, but you can also download it for free. In those 300 to 400 pages, it goes through a lot of specific arguments in the Bible to prove Islam is true. So if you want something a little bit more rigorous, something that's going to give you evidence after evidence after evidence, now you're getting to the point where it's like you could pick out evidences from, like, you know, any direction when it comes to a debate. That book would prepare you for that. You won't need that most of the time, but if you want to get to that level, that book is very useful. Then the next book that I'm recommending here is Scientific Facts in the Quran. It's made by a company or a publishing group called the Quran Project. They have a lot of nice books. This one in particular is showing the scientific signs of the Quran. So when you show them that a lot of the signs are from the 19th and 20th century that were verified, but the Quran already explained this stuff over 1400 years ago, it becomes beyond reasonable doubt for you to basically acknowledge that this is beyond the ability of a human being. And if it's beyond the ability of a human being to construct the Quran, both from a linguistic perspective, which we haven't discussed yet, how the Quran is a linguistic miracle, but it's much easier for a non-Arab to understand that if you have over 1,000 scientific ayat, and many of them can only be proven in the 19th and 20th century, then the answers didn't exist 1400 years ago according to the scientific community who didn't follow the Quran. Therefore, this must have come from something other than human beings. And the only logical answer, because there's no mistakes and no contradictions, is that this book came from Allah, came from the creator of the heavens and the earth. The last book in the bottom right from your angle is a book that talks about God according to the 5 major religions. So Islam is obviously one of the 5 major religions. This book is written by Dr. Zakir Naik, who is the main student of Ahmed Didat. This book will show you, according to Buddhism and according to Hinduism, as well as Judaism and Christianity, the idea that God is omnipotent, that he's only one God, and he's not a multiplicity of gods. Obviously, we know over time, Hinduism, now they have over 1 million idols. So it's a big difference. But you can still find in the original Hindu Vedas actual ayat or verses that are saying that actually God is just one. And unfortunately, over time, the Hindus had changed that. And even though the Buddhists, some of them believe in God, some of them don't. Some Buddhists are actually atheists. So you can prove to them using their own scriptures that God actually does exist. So it's nice to know that, because so far we haven't talked much about Eastern religions outside of Islam. But that book will help you to deal with the major religions of Islam, because there's basically 5, right? Islam is obviously the correct one, but the other 4 major religions is Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism. So you should know a little bit about those if you want to basically have a little bit more leverage in the dawah. You could just use the go-rap method, but it helps to have a background in the other major religions when you're discussing with those people. They would appreciate it if you knew about them. So next slide. Oh, sorry, just because I got to get the projector right at the right angle, which I can't see. This book we did discuss. This book is super, super short, but super, super useful. Why? Because it's only 17 pages long. But in that 17 pages, it's going to show you directly the verses in the Bible that prove the rulings related to hijab, salah, wudu, siyam, circumcision, avoiding riba, the rulings of polygamy, the prohibition of alcohol, the prohibition of lahm khanzir or of pork, the direction of the qibla. That last one wasn't mentioned in this particular book, so I gave the reference for it. It's in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, chapter 6, verse 10. But most of the other stuff, if you see the stuff in green, all those different types of ibadat and amal salihat, they're all mentioned in the Bible, but they're already teachings of Islam. So this will help a Christian to understand that, look, this is a continuation of one religion. Instead of looking at it at Christianity versus Islam, the correct way to look at it, once they understand what Jesus was actually teaching, is that Jesus was actually teaching Islam the whole time. It wasn't two different religions. And when Musa alayhi salam, when he was speaking to Bani Israel, he actually did not call his followers the followers of Judaism. He didn't use this term. So he was just somebody who told his followers to submit to the will of God. And since all the prophets did that, that means they all had one religion. And that religion was Islam. So that's what we would be telling the non-Muslims, inshallah ta'ala. So before we get into the different books of the Bible, this is just a quick reminder for all of us, is that the da'wah, it has its challenges. But in general, this is one of the ways you race towards doing good deeds. And those who race towards good deeds, Allah is telling us in the Quran that these will be the people of Jannah. How do we know this? We find this in Surah Al-Waqiyah. In Surah Al-Waqiyah, Allah tells us between ayat 10 and 14, He says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم والسابقون السابقون أولئك المقربون في جنة النعيم ثلة من الأولين وقليل من الآخرين. Which means that the foremost in good deeds, or the racers in good deeds, they are those who are nearest in the meaning to Allah, in the gardens of bliss, meaning Jannah. Most of them are from the early generation. So the time of the Sahaba, most of them are from the awwaleen. وَقَلِيلٌ مِنَ الْآخِرِينَ, but there will be a few from the future generations to come after. So we can easily fall into the second group here. We are not from the time of the Sahaba. If we look at most of the Muslims today, not to disrespect anybody or to shame anybody, but many of us wouldn't really reach the level of, for example, somebody like Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, who the Prophet said in the morning after Salat al-Fajr, he asked 4 questions. He said, who among you is fasting? Abu Bakr raised his hand. Then he said, who among you visited a sick person today? Abu Bakr raised his hand. He said, who among you has fed a poor person today? Abu Bakr raised his hand. And then he said, who among you has prayed Salat al-Janazah today? And Abu Bakr raised his hand. Abu Bakr did all 4 of these things prior to praying Salat al-Fajr. This was the tariqah, the lifestyle, the way, the path of Abu Bakr. So it's not surprising that ثُلَّةٌ مِّنَ الْأَوَّلِينَ, most of the people who are basically being told about being in paradise are from the early generations. Now, we want to be obviously from that group too. So then hopefully we can be from وَقَلِيلٌ مِّنَ الْآخِرِينَ. We can be from those few that came afterwards who tried we tried our best to take the deen as seriously as we could, and we were inspired by the Sahaba, and we wanted to try to live closely to the way they lived so that we can be close to the prophets, and inshallah we'll be close to them as well on the Day of Judgment. Bi-idhnillah, ameen. And a general verse about da'wah. This doesn't have to be a very long set of verses in the Quran. Most of us, probably all of us, have memorized Surah Al-Asr. Surah Al-Asr is really a surah about da'wah. It's also a surah about using your time wisely. Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah, said, if this was the only surah that Allah revealed, it would have been enough for us. Why would he say something like that? If you look at what is in Surah Al-Asr, you will see why this surah is enough for us in terms of making sure we understand our priorities in life and making sure we're striving for the right reasons. So why would I say that? So the surah says, وَالْعَصْرِ, by time, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي الْخُسْرِ, all mankind is in a loss, meaning everybody would be doomed to Jahannam except For who? إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمِنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. That except for those who believed and did righteous good deeds and advised each other to truth and advised each other to patience. Those are four interesting things. We all know we need Iman to get into Jannah, right? There's no other way around it. We also know that Amal al-Salihat is super important. Some scholars say that if you don't do certain good deeds in Islam, you might not actually stay within the millah, the fold of Islam. I know it's controversial, but some scholars say if you abandon the salah, you're not considered Muslim anymore. Even though that's what the Hanbalis say, and some of the Sahaba, and that the Hanafis and the Malikis and the Shafis disagreed with that. The point is that you don't want to miss any of the obligations in Islam. They're very important. And obviously, when we go, inshallah ta'ala, to Jannah, we'd like to go straight into Jannah. We don't want to have to make a pit stop and end up in Jahannam first, because the fire of Jahannam is 69 or 70 times hotter than the fire, the nar of this earth. So if we can't even handle putting our hand on top of the stove or a fireplace for more than 30 seconds, imagine somebody spending years in Jahannam where the heat is about 70 times hotter than the fire of this earth. Why would anybody, like in their right mind, try to set themselves up for the adhab of Allah, meaning being in Jahannam ala yawm al-qiyamah? Nobody should honestly even think about wanting that. And whoever tries to downplay this, they'll think, oh, hellfire. What did the people before say? What did the Yahud say? They'll say, oh, we'll only be in there for a few days. How do they know? They won't know until they get there. And then if they don't have the right aqidah, they won't get out. So not only do we not want to go to Jahannam, we don't even want to go to Jahannam for 1 second. There's a man, two men actually, on the Day of Judgment, Allah will take two men. One of them lived a miserable life. He was suffering, poverty, sickness, basically any type of hardship you could think of, this man lived this. He will take this man who lived a life of suffering, he will put him into Jannah just for a moment, and then he will take him out, and then he will ask the same man who suffered his whole life while he was in this dunya, he went into Jannah just for a moment. Did you have any suffering in your life? The man will say, Wallahi, I never had any suffering in my entire life. Meaning that's how powerful being in Jannah for a moment is. It erases all the pain and suffering you've ever had in your entire life. There's no sickness, there's no poverty, there's no torture that could overwhelm you or even come to your mind after you go into Jannah. And then Allah will take another person who lived a life of luxury. Imagine some multi-billionaire drug dealer who has power at his fingertips and lived a life of luxury and ease and committed crimes and atrocities and never got in trouble for any of it. Allah will take somebody maybe even worse than this. He'll take a very bad person but lived a very easy life, or at least we know he lived an amazingly easy life. He'll just dip him into Jahannam just for a moment. Then he'll take him out. Then he'll ask this person who lived a life of ease and luxury in this life, did you ever experience any joy in this dunya? He'll say, Wallahi, I never experienced any joy. This person who lived his whole life in ease, right? That's what one moment in Jahannam will do. It will erase any memory of happiness you've ever had. So imagine, if this is the reality, how could anybody at this point say, you know, what's Jahannam? It's a really big deal if you know what it really is. Nobody would dare to set themselves up for that. So, and the last 2 points is that وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. When you have good deeds and you have Iman, you also want to advise others to stay on the right path. But as you do that, realize there's going to be people trying to fight you back. That's what I was trying to tell you. In the da'wah, there will be people that will yell at you, criticize you, blackmail you, threaten you. They might even try to be physically abusive with you. So, وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. And they call each other to patience. Because just like the Anbiya والسلام, and the Sahaba, they had to call each other to patience because they didn't have always an easy time calling people to the truth of Islam, which is tariqatun najah, the path to salvation. So these are now, what we're going to look at now, this is the breakdown of the books in the Bible. Somebody wanted to know about this on lesson 1. I said, inshallah, we're going to get to it. Today we're getting to it. So the Bible it's basically composed of 66 books, but that's the minimum number. Depending on who you talk to, if you're talking to a Roman Catholic, he'll tell you there's 73 or 76 books in the Bible. If you're talking to a Protestant, he'll say 66. If you're talking to an Ethiopian Christian, he'll say there's 83 books in the Bible. If you go to any Muslim, how many surahs are there in the Quran? We all know, right? 114. No ikhtilaf. La rayba fi. So, but for Christians, it's a different story. From these 66, if you go with the minimum number, there's two major sections. You have the Old Testament. This is basically the life of all the prophets before Isa alayhi salam, before Jesus, peace be upon him. So the Old Testament is all these books you see below. The Torah, we say, is like the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then you have books of the major prophets, 5 books about that, 12 books about the minor prophets, 12 books about history in the Bible, and 5 books about poetry. This is the Old Testament. Then the story of Isa alayhi salam and the life after him, so the life of the companions and the life of Paul or Saul of Tarsus, this is what the New Testament is. And in the New Testament, you start off first with the 4 Gospels, the book or the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are 4 different narratives that were written around 60 to 120 years after the lifetime of Isa alayhi salam by people who did not claim to be disciples, who did not mention their last names, who did not mention their lineage, who did not say they even wrote the books that were being written and ascribed to them. Somebody else said that they wrote them. But these 4 books are 4 different accounts of what they think happened 60 or 120 years before their time, which is the time of Isa alayhi salam. So most Christians will tell you these were only the writers or these were historians who were writing about the story of Isa alayhi salam much later. They were not eyewitnesses. It's very important to note because many Christians will say, no, these must be the Hawariyun. They must be the disciples. Well, their names, some of them don't even match up because we don't have a Luke from the disciples. And we said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we don't have a Matthew. So we're missing 2 of the names already from the 4. That's a problem. Then, to add to injury, if you look at the other books, almost all of them are unanimously written by a man named Paul. So if you actually look at all the books of the New Testament, you have 4 books of the Gospels, but then you have 8 books, and then a book of Revelation, so you have 9, and then you have 13 books added to that, plus an additional book there. All these other remaining books, except for one being maybe attributed to Luke, everything else in the New Testament, for the most part, is generally seen to be written by one man who was named Paul or Saul of Tarsus. We said he never walked, he never talked, he never met Isa alayhi salam in his life. He was a Christian bounty hunter. He used to go around killing Christians for money. And just because he had a dream or a vision, like a daydream, that he thought Jesus came to erase the sins of humanity, and then he started preaching this message, and because the Roman Catholic Church accepted him as an authority, he ended up becoming the mainstream belief system for the Christians of today. That's why they're so confused. But if you actually look at even the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can still find enough verses to clearly prove that the Trinity is wrong, that Jesus did not come to die for people's sins, but you have to know where to look to make that obvious. If we're looking at the Bible and we look at the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, there's literally hundreds of different versions of the Bible. But if you look at the Revised Standard Version, which is approved by the Roman Catholic Church, they will admit, this is the Roman Catholic Church now, the Christians from this biggest denomination of Christianity, they are telling you that 1/3 of the entire Old Testament, that's the bigger section of the Bible, is completely unknown. They have no idea who wrote it. Whereas when it comes to the Quran, we have mutawatir reports for every surah of the Quran. We can verify every surah, and we have people who memorize it both in memory and in writing. And then obviously with hadith, it's not as rigorous, but we still have this science of isnad, of chains of transmission. The Bible doesn't do that. The Bible has no isnad. They don't say an fulan, an fulan, an fulan. They don't say hadathana, hadathana, hadathana. They don't say They don't say Imam Malik, حدثنا النافع, حدثنا Ibn Umar, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. They don't have this. They just have, whenever they have any writings, they might have the name of an author, but we won't usually know who their last name is. We won't know their lineage. We won't be able to prove where they lived, where they were born, where they died. But in the science of hadith and in the science of preserving the Quran, we know who the narrators are. We know who their parents are. We know where they lived. We know who they studied under. They don't have this access in the Bible, and a lot of it is just simply unknown. There are even some books which some denominations, they reject entire books of the Bible. So the same Roman Catholics, they have 7 additional books. It's called the Apocrypha, which kind of means like hidden. And the Protestants, they reject all 7 of these books. So that's already showing you the shakiness of the Bible. How could the Bible be perfectly preserved if 7 entire mini books? Imagine if somebody had a doubt about 7 surahs of the Quran. First of all, from an Islamic perspective, this would be kufr. But I'm saying for the Christians, they have doubt for 7 entire books. It's like doubting 7 big surahs of the Bible. That's like the equivalent of what they're doing here. And these are some of the names of the books that they don't know. They don't know who wrote First Chronicles, the book of Esther, the book of Job, which is like another way of saying Ayub, the book of Ecclesiastes, Jonah, which is another way of saying Yunus alayhi salam, the book of Malachi, First Chronicles, and so forth, right? So there's just some other books on the side here. Tobit, Judith, Baruch, Wisdom, Sirach, First and Second Maccabees. These books specifically are from the Apocrypha. The books on the left side are other books that are not even from the 7 books that are also doubtful. So if any Christian claims that this book has been perfectly preserved, they're lying to themselves, and they didn't even listen to their own scholars and their own preachers and teachers and priests and bishops who have said otherwise. So now we get to the point of, what did Paul teach? This guy who basically radically destroyed the Islamic Aqidah system within Christianity. So since he wrote half of the book, we should probably find out what he actually wrote. So Paul, he wrote that your deeds are like filthy rags, your amal salihat is worthless, according to him, and your salvation, your najat, is just believe in Isa, and then inshallah all your sins will be forgiven, according to him. So he writes, but now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested. He wrote this in the book of Romans, which he wrote, chapter 3, verse 20. He is telling you that now, basically, you can just get into Jannah by God's righteousness and without following the law, meaning that you don't have to follow ahkam shar'iyya. You don't actually have to obey Allah anymore. You don't have to follow any more rules, according to Paul, not according to Jesus, and not according to James, which is one of his Hawariyun, according to the Bible. So if you look at one of the Hawariyun, the disciples, it mentions that the disciple named James, in the book of James, chapter 2, verse 17, he argues with Paul in the Bible that you got it wrong, basically, is what he's telling him. He said, but wilt thou know, O vain man, that faith without works is dead. So now you have a disciple, a sahabi, directly challenging and correcting Paul in the Bible, and it's still there today. How Christians miss this, I don't know. I really don't know. Oh, I think I do know. Because they're told from a young age that Jesus died for your sins, so then why would they do an investigation? Like, I remember my cousin telling me, why do you ask so many questions about Christianity? He said, if I remember correctly, it's just like a 5-star cruise. You just get on the boat, enjoy the ride. How do you know you're going to the right destination? Maybe you should ask questions. If you just randomly got on any boat and you don't even know where you're going, does that sound like a wise plan? Not really. But this is the mentality of the modern day Christian. And who knows how long they've been thinking like this for, but with time, it just becomes more obvious that they really don't care about studying their own scripture. So we know we need to have good deeds and we need to have iman. Not just according to Islam, according to James, according to the Hawariyun, and obviously according to Isa alayhi salam. Because Isa alayhi salam said in the Bible, in the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 20, he said to the Yahud, ulama, to the Jewish rabbis, he said to them, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, which are the Jewish ulama. He said, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he says, if you're not better than these scholars of the Jews, لا يدخل الجنة. I mentioned this verse before, like maybe 1 or 2 lectures ago. What does this prove? It proves this idea that Jesus died for you is a complete lie. It's a complete hoax, according to Jesus in the Bible. Otherwise, why would he say that? If you just have to believe and that's it. Obviously, there's more to the story here. So, aside from the fact that we've shown you that the Bible is not the same number of surahs or the same number of mini books within the Bible, because we know Protestants, 66. For them, the Bible is 66 books. Ethiopian Christians, 84 books. I think I said 83 earlier, so it looks like it's 84. Sorry, I was off by 1 book there. And Eastern Orthodox Christians, it's 76 books. And Roman Catholics, for them, it's 80 books. So depending on who you talk to, you're going to get a different number. And on top of that, if that wasn't enough to prove to you that the Bible is not perfectly preserved, then just read what the Bible says about itself without even asking anybody else. Just go to Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 8. It says, how can you say we are wise, for we have the law of the Lord, when actually the lying pen of the scribes has handled it falsely? Scribes, katibin, are people who write down stuff. So the people who wrote down the Bible is criticizing them for basically lying about what they wrote down. And that's the Bible saying this. So if they say, we believe the Bible is the complete word of God, then you have to believe in this verse, which is in the Bible. So the Bible is telling you not to believe it's preserved. Therefore, you have to believe it's not preserved. So it's not. Simple as that. And we said, in terms of proving more contradictions, if you just look at the translations, they have deliberately tried to hide verses that disprove the Trinity because they know it's all over the place in the Bible. This is one of the biggest examples. Just go to BibleHub.com and then look up the passage within the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 70. Look at the different translations and see what they've done in the last 50 years. They took a verse that says that the Jews were throwing rocks at Isa alayhi salam, and Jesus said to them, why are you throwing rocks at me? And he said, they said to him, after he said, why are you throwing rocks at me? The Jews responded, you have committed blasphemy. You have committed kufr. That's what they're saying. You claim you're the Son of God. Jesus said, you say that I am. That's your claim. Now, look at the translations from this link. I put it in the PowerPoint. Look at it when you have some time or Google it. Same verse, Bible Hub. Go to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 70. You will see 50 years ago, the Bible in English said, you say that I am. And then check the last 10 years. It'll say, yes, it is true that I say that I am. That is a complete lie. That is a complete opposite meaning of the original translation. And that is absolute forgery on top of forgery. That is how unreliable the Bible is today. But we can prove where the mistakes happened so that no Christian in his right mind would say that the Bible is perfectly preserved. And we have Gospels, many Gospels. We said there's 4 Gospels, right? We said Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you ask any Christian, they'll say, well, that's it. Well, actually, that's not true. There's at least 80 Gospels that exist. And there's a woman, her name is Catherine, I think it's Catherine Armstrong. Catherine Armstrong. She one time she came and she gave a talk at RIS, Reviving the Islamic Spirit in Toronto. It's like an Islamic convention. But she's a Jewish/Oriental scholar, but she doesn't seem to be attacking Islam. At one point, she actually sort of defended, not really Islam directly, but she showed the corruption of Christianity. She said that we have basically historical documents proving that there were over 80 Gospels of the Bible, of the New Testament. Only 4 of them today are widely circulated, which is the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we have found actually some of these manuscripts now. So some of them include the Gospel of Barnabas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of James. And these other Gospels are teaching that Jesus didn't claim he was God. He was a prophet of God, but he didn't claim he was God. He didn't claim he was the Son of God and didn't die for the sins of humanity. And for example, the Gospel of Barnabas, there is a carbon dated version of it, which is over 40, it's at least 1,500 years old. So not only does that mean that it's a credible resource, it existed before the time of the Quran. So if somebody says, oh wait, you guys just made this in a lab and then you're using the Gospel of Barnabas to prove Islam is right because it came after the Quran, well, it didn't come after. It came before. It came at least 100 years or about 100 years before the time of the Quran, meaning that we had other Gospels that taught the Islamic narrative before the Quran was even being revealed to mankind. It's important to note. This Gospel, by the way, also shows that Paul is an imposter, is a fake, just like was mentioned in the book of James, which still is in the Bible. The book of James is in the Bible, and it's basically, without calling him directly an imposter, is telling Paul, you got your belief system wrong, which we already looked at. So we have exactly 10 minutes until Salat al-Isha. I'm just going to maybe go through this rapid fire, and then inshallah Salah will start in about 10 minutes. So if you want to answer any of these questions from the quiz, feel free. If I don't get any responses within about 5 to 10 seconds, I'm just going to tell you the answers. But hopefully you remember some of the stuff from the last few lectures. So this was from today's lecture. How many books is in the Protestant Bible? It's a number between 60 and 70. Anybody remember? 6 is the first number, and then the second number is another 6. So 66 books is the smallest version of the Bible, which the Protestants follow, the 66 book version, which is what we looked at the diagram on. The second question is, the two main divisions of the Bible are the what and what Testament? The Old and New, right? And the Old is the bigger one, all the stories of the prophets before Isa alayhi salam, and the New Testament is the story of Isa alayhi salam and Paul, basically, and some stories of the disciples. Question 3, which disciple of Jesus said you need to follow, there's a misprint here. You need to basically have good deeds and have faith as a true believer. So you have 3 of the 5 letters. So which disciple said you have to have iman wa amalu salihat? You can't just say, I believe in Jesus and that's it. So it was James. That is the right answer. So, and remember, that book of James is still in the Bible today. And he's still refuting Paul in the Bible of today. So just so you know that that's not from one of the faraway Gospels. That one is intact, and you can still use that as a reference from the Bible today. Question 4, who came after the time of Isa alayhi salam and argued with the disciples that they don't need to have good deeds, and he called them filthy rags. So basically called the amal salihat filthy rags, and that you only have to believe in Jesus as your salvation. 4 letters, starts with P. We've mentioned him a whole lot by now. Paul. So that's the troublemaker. That's the Dajjal of their times. And then question 5, how many Gospels did not make it into the New Testament? It was a number that was between 70 and 90. Anybody remember? So Catherine Armstrong said there are 80 Gospels at least that did not make it into the New Testament. What exists today is the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What existed about 2024-ish years ago was about at least 80 books. Question, what are we at now? Question 5 or 6? 6. How many books are in the current Bible of today? So we already kind of mentioned this earlier. The minimum number is 66. Highest is 84. Question 7, who wrote 60% of the, I'm going to just speed up now because of the time. So Paul wrote 60% of the New Testament. Which chapter or verse of the Bible proves that the Jewish scholars changed the Bible? That was the book of Jeremiah, chapter 8, verse 8. That's a really good verse to remember. You don't have to memorize the verse, just remember where it is. Jeremiah, chapter 8, verse 8. You just Google that, you'll find the passage that the Bible has been forged by the people who wrote it down in the Bible. And come on, clicker, listen to me. What are the names of the four chosen Gospels? MMLJ, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You're going to answer it. And in Luke chapter 22, verse 70, when the Jewish scholars claimed Isa alayhi salam claimed to be the Son of God, how did he actually respond? He said, "You say that I am." Still there today. Only in the last, I'd say, the last 50 years, especially the last 2 decades, now you can see the translation was completely flipped so they could hide the fact that Jesus denied the Trinity in the Bible. And then question 11, which was the 1500-year-old gospel in Turkey that clearly said Jesus was not crucified and that Paul was an impostor? That was the gospel of something with a B, Barnabas. So that's good to know. And it existed at least 1500 years ago, which means it came before the time of the Quran. So nobody can say we set this up. And then Roman Catholic Christians have an additional, how many books compared to Protestants? Between 5 and 10, so it would be number 7. So 7 additional books that they have. And every Quran, alhamdulillah, has exactly how many surahs? 114. And there's no disagreement on, according to any Muslim, at least from Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, zero ikhtilaf on this issue. And then all the biblical prophets before Isa alayhi salam is mentioned in the Old Testament. So this is just a quick comprehension mini quiz, not graded obviously, just to make sure that you guys are following the material. And just a quick reminder, you guys have about 10 days to finish the assignment, which is basically only half a page to a page in length. I asked you guys to watch a just under 20-minute video that explains the go-rap method on how you can basically convince somebody that Islam is true. And even though the video is just under 20 minutes, the actual task of doing it can be done in like 5 minutes or less. So the assignment, you have to watch the video and then answer some questions that are also related to the lecture material that we discussed. And then basically in 10 days, answer all these questions and submit it on the Google Classroom. That's if you're a credit student. If you're an audit student, just enjoy listening to my voice. I know it's not like singing opera or anything, but hopefully you just get some benefit from listening. But if you are a credit student, then you'll want to try to finish that in 10 days. If you have a special circumstance and you need extra time, then just send me a message on why you need a week or 2 extension, and then we can accommodate for you, inshallah. And just remember, at the end of the course, the other 50% of the mark will be based on an exam, which will be multiple choice, and I will just submit the link for a Google Forms exam basically on the Google Classroom, and you will just be able to access that for a period of a week. Just click on the link, and then the 40 or 50 questions will come up, all multiple choice. You will get your grade results as soon as you complete the exam, because it's all automated by the computer. It'll give you your grade as soon as you complete the exam, inshallah ta'ala. And the next class, we'll cover lesson 7, which deals with prophecies of Prophet Muhammad in the Bible, and more specific details about the 4 Gospels, and also prophecies that Prophet Muhammad himself already fulfilled in our times, or basically sometime after his time. So we'll look at things that we've already discussed, how there's over 1,000 scientific ayat in the Quran, but there are also predictions or prophecies that the Prophet had prophesied in his lifetime, and already 101 of them have been confirmed, at least. So we'll be looking at those, and I will give you the link in reference. So if you want to look at all 101, you can do that on your own time, inshallah ta'ala. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The salah will start in about 2 minutes, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khairan.